So the next case that I'll be discussing is management of a child with hydrocephalus. So coming to the case scenario, parents present their 2-month-old child with chief complaints of recurrent vomiting for last 2 days and increase in head size since birth. Parents gave the history that child was born at 37 weeks of gestation and was a normal vaginal delivery. Since then, there is progressive increase in the head size. The child remains irritable, is lethargic and feeds poorly and is unable to hold head. In the antenatal history, we have to ask whether the mother had any infections during the antenatal period, whether she went for regular antenatal checkups or did she get the ultrasonography done? Did she take the folic acid during her antenatal period? Regarding the milestones, for any pediatric case, we should be well aware of the milestones as well as the anthropometric measurements. This is important not only for a neurosurgical case, but any pediatric case that you may get during your examination. So this child is unable to hold head at the age of 2 months. In the family history, the elder sibling is healthy and there is no history of similar congenital anomaly in any of the family members. The child is immunized till date and he hasn't received treatment either for this complaint or any other medical illness in the past. On examination, the child is conscious, was somnolent, had 2 episodes of vomiting since morning, seemed dehydrated, was lethargic, and the pulse rate was around 100 per minute with a blood pressure of around 80 by 50 mm of Hg. Now, this is the chart showing the pediatric GCS. This might not be important for PGs, but I would suggest those doing PDCC, please go through the pediatric GCS. It is slightly different from the adult GCS and you might be asked in the examination. Now, on examination, the head circumference was increased 48 centimeter. You should be well aware of all these measurements. At the age of 2 months, usually the head size is around 38 centimeter. So we can see that it is clearly increased in size. The overlying skin was shiny, revealing dilated veins. The sunset sign can be appreciated in the eyes. In this, there is the upward gaze fallacy and the upper sclera is visible. There is bossing of forehead, which is a sign of raised intracranial pressure. The anterior fontanelle, which normally closes around 9 to 18 months, is open, wide and bulging, and the posterior fontanelle, which normally closes at 2 to 3 months, was also full. Pupils were sluggishly reacting to light and there was no papilledema. It's also important to thoroughly examine the other systems because these children have a high incidence of other congenital anomalies. Remember the acronym VACTRAL, which stands for vertebral anomalies, anal atresia, cardiac defects, tracheoesophageal fistula, and renal and radial anomalies. Other than the systemic examination, it is very important to examine the spine. Patients may present with a swelling in the lumbosacral area known as meningomyelocele or in the cervical area known as the encephalocele. Patients with meningomyelocele or the neural tube defects, they have a high incidence of associated hydrocephalus and this is as high as 70%. So we have to be very careful. If such a child comes to us, we have to be very careful taking care that the swelling is not compressed by any external pressure to avoid its rupture or increase in the ICP. So while intubating such a child, when we place the patient supine, we have to ensure we keep a donut size. We make a donut and place the sac safely inside it to avoid any direct pressure on the sac. Similarly, for the encephalocele, also we use the same donut and we place the sac inside that donut to avoid the direct compression on the sac. Now for the confirmation, we have to get a computerized tomography done, that is a CT scan head to be done, which will reveal the size of the ventricle, the cause of the increase in ICP, which can be due to a tumor, aqueductal stenosis or Arnold-Chiari malformation. And also if it's an obstructive sort of hydrocephalus, we'll be also able to appreciate the site of obstruction. Now, this is a CT scan revealing the hydrocephalus. The features of the raised ICP is the loss of the white and the gray differentiation. The sulci are effaced and there is dilatation of the ventricles. Now, in this middle picture, we can see that there is dilation of the lateral ventricles. The ballooning of the frontal horns of the lateral ventricles is also known as a Mickey Mouse sign. This is the third ventricle, which is normally a slit-like structure. any ballooning of third ventricle, it indicates that there is high presence of hydrocephalus. So now the lateral ventricles and the third ventricles all are dilated. So it seems like that the site of obstruction is somewhere below third ventricle. What is hydrocephalus? It's an abnormal or excessive accumulation of CSF in the intracranial cavity due to the disturbance in either formation, flow, or absorption of CSF. Now, the CSF, it flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle through the foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle, it passes into the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of Sylvie. And from the fourth ventricle, it passes into the cisterns through the foramen of Magendie and the lateral foramen of Rushka. The CSF is formed in the choroid plexus present in the lateral ventricles. Now, the normal CSF pressure in children is around 3 to 7.5 mmHg, which is quite lower as compared to the adults. And its volume in infants is around 40 to 60 ml, young children 60 to 100 ml, and in older children it's 80 to 100 ml. The adult level is around 150 ml. The rate of formation of CSF is 0.3 to 0.4 ml per minute. Now, the types of hydrocephalus, there are different classification systems. So first I'll be discussing the communicating or the non-obstructive type, or the obstructive or the non-communicating type. So the communicating type, it is either due to excessive formation and decreased absorption. Excessive formation can be seen in the choroid plexus papilloma, and decreased absorption can be due to post-traumatic or post-hemorrhagic due to the silting of the arachnoid granulations. Post-inflammatory meningitis or cerebral abscess can result in the scarring and decreased absorption of the CSF. Similarly, congenital infections also lead to decrease in the absorption of CSF. Coming to the congenital non-communicative hydrocephalus, the most common cause are the congenital anomalies such as aqueductal stenosis, Arnold-Chiari malformation, Dandy-Walker syndrome, and the neural tube defects such as meningomyelocele. The other non-communicative causes of hydrocephalus are brain tumors and the presence of arteriovenous malformation. Another classification is the congenital causes and the acquired causes. In the congenital causes, it's aqueductal stenosis, neural tube defects, Dandy-Walker syndrome, mucopolysaccharidosis, and X-linked hydrocephalus. In the acquired causes, it's either due to aqueductal stenosis, hemorrhage of prematurity, brain cysts on the tumors, infections, and traumatic brain injury. Now, the therapeutic management, our goals are to relieve the hydrocephalus and treat the complications. The investigations that we require for the surgery in the preoperative period are the hemoglobin, sodium and the potassium, the electrolytes. These are very important because the child is constantly vomiting, seems dehydrated, and is also now prescribed osmotic diuretics. So we should know the levels of electrolytes. Renal function test, coagulation study, and chest X-ray. Chest X-ray is also important to rule out any other congenital anomalies present in the child. Now, the treatment modalities are either to drain the CSF from ventricles or to make an opening to assist in the flow. So to drain the CSF from the ventricles, external ventricular drainage can be done in an emergency scenario when the child has altered consciousness and there is impending signs of herniation. Otherwise, ventriculoperitoneal, ventriculoatrial, and the lumboperitoneal shunts can be done, which divert the flow of CSF from the ventricles either to the peritoneal cavity or into the atrium of the heart, or in the peritoneal or in the lumbar area. Then comes the endoscopic third ventriculostomy. I'll be discussing this later. Now, in the pre-op assessment, see in a child if he has signs of raised ICP, assess the level of consciousness, see the underlying cause of hydrocephalus, and whether any pre-surgery temporizing measures have been taken, such as any EVD ventriculostomy or the external ventricular drainage has been done, and what's the treatment is he on, whether he's on any medical measures. Assess the fluid status, whether the child seems dehydrated or not. Assess the associated congenital anomalies, rule out all those of congenital anomalies, especially the cardiac ones and the pulmonary ones. Assess the airway. It's very difficult to assess the airway in such small children, but see for the outer craniofacial abnormalities and whether the child has any associated syndromes. Age-related pathophysiology related to prematurity. Such children can have apnea in the postoperative period. And also it's very important, especially in the children who have neural tube defects, we have to see whether any history of latex allergy is there. Goals of anesthesia is maintenance of cerebral perfusion pressure, control of hemodynamics, and smooth extubation. The anesthetic management in the pre-medication, usually pre-medication is not required in such small children because of the hydrocephalus, they are already somnolent and lethargic. So any resultant respiratory depression can increase the ICP further, leading to herniation. The NPO, the nil per oral guidelines for such children remain the same, 6 hours for solids and 2 hours for clear fluids. So regarding the preparation of the OT, the child is very small, so we have to ensure that the OT temperature is quite warm, ranging from 24 to 25 degrees Celsius. Arrange all the pediatric equipment beforehand. See for the emergency drugs, and also ventilator should be set according to the pediatric settings. The non-invasive monitoring is usually attached beforehand: ECG, non-invasive blood pressure, and pulse oximetry. Now, the method of induction depends upon the level of anxiety of the child's ability to cooperate and communicate, the presence or the absence of a full stomach, and intravenous access. The intravenous induction of anesthesia is usually preferable because these patients already have increased intracranial pressure, and using the volatiles can further increase the pressure. So if it's very safe to secure an intravenous line beforehand and go for intravenous induction. The intravenous induction is usually done in a standard manner using fentanyl, propofol, and for muscle relaxation, we can use rocuronium. And in case the patient has difficult venous access and you are not able to secure a intravenous line, then the last resort can be inhalational induction of anesthesia using sevoflurane, but ensure that you hyperventilate during this inhalational induction to wash out any CO2. But it's always safe to go for intravenous induction of anesthesia in these children. The intubation can be quite difficult because of increase in the head. So it's better to align the oral, pharyngeal, and the laryngeal axis by keeping a sheet beneath the shoulders. So maintain the anesthesia with a volatile agent, oxygen and air. PCO2 should be maintained around 30 to 32 mm of Hg. And before starting the surgery, paracetamol suppository can be also inserted rectally. So the intraoperative concerns are the patient is usually positioned with the head extended and turned towards the opposite side. Usually VP shunt is done on the right side as it's non-dominant in majority of the population. So during positioning, we have to take care of that there is no dislodgement of the endotracheal tube and take care of the intravenous lines. Avoid hypercarbia, hypoxia, and hyperglycemia in these children. These children are usually dehydrated, so you have to give fluids, but ensure that you don't overfill them because the renal system is still not mature. Maintain normovolemia. Hemodynamic changes and arrhythmias are very commonly seen, especially if the CSF is drained very rapidly. So you have to be very careful and for the hemodynamic changes. Now, for this surgery, the child is usually exposed from head to torso, and so this exposure of the torso and the large part of the body, it predisposes the children to hypothermia. So to prevent the hypothermia, we have to increase the ambient pressure of the OT. You wrap all the limbs with the cotton pads. Use a warm mattress if available. Use overhead heaters if available. Try to use warm fluids and ensure that you maintain the temperature of the child. Surgical stimulation during tunneling. it leads to, it's a very noxious stimulus and it can lead to hypertension and tachycardia. So a short acting opioid or increasing the depth of anesthesia might help during this period. So after the surgery is over, the neuromuscular blockade is reversed. The child is extubated only if he is awake and the airway reflexes return completely. Ensure that the child is normothermic before extubation. Patients that can be extubated, they often require supplemental oxygen and apnea monitoring for 24 hours in the post-operative period, in addition to regular neurological observation. So it is very good thing if we can shift them to an ICU for at least next 24 hours. Post-operative care, we have to observe for signs of increased intracranial pressure. This may indicate obstruction of the shunt. So for this, we have to assess the neurological status, assess the pupil size, see the abdominal distension. Sometimes what happens that the catheter can, the distal end of the catheter, which is placed in the peritoneal cavity, can cause damage to the internal organs and it can lead to abdominal distension. There can be respiratory distress or episodes of apnea. So the complications of this surgery are acute lowering of the intracranial pressure due to the drainage of the CSF can lead to the rupture of the bridging veins, which can lead to the development of a subdural hematoma. Even intracranial hemorrhage can occur if there is any direct blood vessel injury during the insertion of the cranial end of the shunt. Due to the tunneling during the tunneling of placement for the placement of the VP shunt, there can occur pneumothorax, especially in the obese patients. There can be shunt infection, shunt obstruction. These are usually the late complications. CSF over drainage. This can result in the headache and lowering of the intracranial pressure. And on the CT scan, the ventricles seem like slit-like, and there can be abdominal injury. So the complications, shunt failure, what are the, it's a very common complication, and what are its features? The child becomes irritable, the fontanelles are bulging, the raised ICP features will be evident, patient may have nausea, vomiting, there will be loss of developmental milestones, and again the head circumference might increase. So you have to carefully watch for these complications in the post-operative period. Now, what's an endoscopic third ventriculostomy? It's an endoscopic procedure used to treat obstructive hydrocephalus. Instead of draining the CSF away, it keeps the cerebrospinal fluid within the brain and the spinal cord. The neurosurgeon makes a hole in the thin membrane at the floor of the third ventricle, which allows the fluid into the subarachnoid space. So with an endoscope, an opening is made in the floor of the third ventricle, so that the CSF now can flow directly from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle, bypassing this narrow cerebral aqueduct. The intraoperative complications, usually in this endoscopic surgery, irrigating fluid is used constantly to distend the ventricle, which if not drained appropriately can cause an increase in the ICP. Hemodynamic changes may occur because of the stimulation of the nearby structures, and especially if the irrigating fluid is not drained, it can lead to the raised ICP and Cushing's reflex. For the same reasons, because a large amount of irrigating cord fluid is used, patient can develop hypothermia. There can be electrolyte imbalance because of this electrolyte fluid used, and patient might have bleeding if the basilar arteries, which are very nearby, are damaged. Excuse me. Thank you.